Soul Series starting in a week or so, it's time to figure out who won the MLB offseason. In this video, we'll be giving every team a grade on their performance, as well as discussing the signings, trades, and unretained free agents that they have. If you enjoy this sort of content, please be sure to subscribe, and let's go ahead and get into the video. Starting off, let's talk about one of the more underrated off seasons with the Kansas City Royals. They didn't necessarily go out and do anything spectacular. They didn't sign a superstar by any means, but they filled a lot of the holes on the team with serviceable level MLB level talent. A lot of this team is built around the young superstars that they have either already on the roster or coming up, and they just needed to fill the holes for the time being, and I think they did a pretty good job of that. You look at the pitching side, especially from the bullpen, they spent a lot of their efforts there, signing right-handers Chris Stratton and trading for Nick Anderson, as well as grabbing Will Smith, which means, they'll win the World Series. But they also grabbed right-handed starting pitchers Seth Lugo and Michael Wacha, and also filled some key cogs on their defensive side with Hunter Renfroe, Adam Frazier, and Austin Nola. Again, not huge superstar players, but just good serviceable level players that will fill a niche role as they are set to do so in 2024. And also probably the biggest news of all, they re-signed Bobby Witt Jr., their young superstar shortstop, to an 11-year contract through the year 2034. If that doesn't constitute to a decent offseason, I don't know what does, so I gave the Kansas City Royals a B-. A less inspiring offseason for me came from the Boston Red Sox, mainly because I don't know what direction they're going. It seemed like they wanted to get rid of a lot of the aged on their team. They lost Corey Kluber, Justin Turner, Chris Sale, even got rid of Alex Verdugo, who's only 28 years old, so I really didn't understand the direction they're going. But then they went ahead and signed Liam Hendriks. They signed Lucas Giolito, who hasn't been good in some time. They just made some questionable signings and then got rid of some of their more known commodities. Didn't re-sign James Paxton, didn't re-sign Adam Duvall. Just really was a confusing offseason, but they went ahead and signed Brian Bayo, so that's a good signing, but it's just it was a lot of misdirection for me from the Boston Red Sox, and I really didn't understand it. They did bring in Tyler O'Neill, who has looked great so far this spring, but just really confusing from me, and that's why I had to give them a D. Another kind of middle-of-the-table offseason for me came from the New York Mets. They really still have a good core of players, but just didn't really have the funds to really round out this roster with more talent. We saw them kind of go all in last year, and it just did not work, and now they're having to kind of have the negative effects of that kind of in place. You see that they didn't really sign too many guys that really moved the needle too much for them. They signed a bunch of league average type guys that just kind of fill a role for the time being. Obviously, you would like to see them do more with the core of players they have, but they're just kind of handcuffed at the moment. And I think they did okay for what they can do. They did lose out on some top free agents early and just kind of left them with just type players. So for that, I'm going to go ahead and give them a D as well. Another team that had a lot of revolving parts that I think at the end of the day benefited massively was the San Francisco Giants. Yes, they lost a good bit with some of their franchise staples leaving in free agency, but you look at who they brought in, I think they did a really good job, especially for not getting any of the super high ticket free agents. You look, they brought in Matt Chapman, Jorge Soler, Jordan Hicks, Tom Murphy, Jung-Hoo Lee, and then you look at who they lost. They lost Brandon Crawford, Jock Peterson, lost Sean Manaea, lost Anthony Symphony, Ross Stripling. So yeah, they lost some, but I think they brought in more than they lost, and I like the aggressive nature, especially considering this is a team that kind of has been in a rut ever since they just randomly won a bunch of games in 2021. And I just think that this team did better than a lot of teams about being aggressive and making the moves that needed to be made. They realized that they needed a lot of change within this team, and I think they did a pretty good job this offseason, especially staying patient with some of these guys signing late, and for that, I gave them a B+. Over the offseason, I think the Chicago Cubs did pretty well to just kind of maintain the roster they had, who I think underperformed a good bit last season, but they brought back Cody Bellinger, who was a big kind of staple turning linchpin for them, brought him back on a 3-year deal. He was excellent last year, but also brought in Shota Imanaga from the Japanese league. So that's always a great signing to bring in somebody like that. Unfortunately, that meant that they basically swapped him for Marcus Stroman, who unfortunately did go to the New York Yankees. So I don't necessarily love the idea of trading a known commodity for an unknown commodity, because you never know how that transition from foreign leagues is going to go to the MLB. Obviously, it's probably getting a little bit easier, but you never know how that goes. But they also brought in Hector Neris as well on a 1-year deal. So they brought in some good pieces. They also brought in guys like Garrett Cooper, David Peralta, Carl Edwards Jr. on minor league contracts who could come up and fill a role at any given time. So I think they did improve slightly, but it wasn't the big improvement that I would have liked to see them make to absolutely take a stranglehold on this division. And for that, I'm going to give them a C. Next on the list is last year's World Series champion, the Texas Rangers, who did have a bit of a rough offseason. They just lost a lot of talent, a lot of which they had acquired, on 1-year deals or at the trade deadline. So it wasn't like the biggest loss, but man, they lost a lot. They lost Jordan Montgomery, Mitch Garver, Chris Stratton, Aroldis Chapman, Martin Perez, Will Smith, Ian Kennedy, Matt Bush, even people like Travis Janikowski, who really didn't do all that much, but it's just a lot of MLB level talent walking out the door. Yes, they still have the stars of this team, but they lost a lot, especially just quality depth. And I think they try to do their best to incorporate that, but it's just hard to bring that much MLB talent back in. They got David Robertson, got Andrew Kisner to fill the backup catcher role, brought in Trevor Malley and Kirby Yates, but just they lost a lot. And that's like understandable, especially for a World Series team that has to pay a lot of big names. And for that, I'm going to give them a D plus, just because they did bring in a couple of nice pieces to help kind of replace some of that value. Next is the Washington Nationals, that certainly don't have to pay any big names quite yet, but the prospects are coming, I promise. And the level of talent that the Nationals brought in the offseason kind of reflects that the talent is just not quite there yet. If you look at who they brought in, they've brought in a lot of low-risk, high-reward type players. You look Joey Gallo, even a flyer on a guy like Nick Senzel, Dylan Floro, even guys like Jesse Winker and Eddie Rosario. If they get hot at the right time, they become trade pieces. You get prospects back, and they could help out your team early on in the season. This is a Nationals team that I think is starting to creep up a little bit better, but they're just in a really tough position in that division, and I just don't think they'll make that breakout this year. But I think these are some excellent signings to kind of just be some trade bait at the trade deadline if that kind of is your situation. And I'm going to go ahead and give them a D plus for their efforts. If you're noticing that outfit change, it's because this video took a really long time to record. And also, Dylan Cease trade went through with the San Diego Padres, meaning the Los Angeles Angels have the worst offseason. Woo! Let's give it up, baby. But seriously, I mean, what are we doing here for the Los Angeles Angels? We can talk about Shohei Ohtani leaving all day and how they mishandled that situation. They could have got the absolute bag back last trade deadline if they had traded him, but they decided to keep him because they didn't want to be that guy that traded Shohei Ohtani, and they got nothing back. They let him walk in free agency, and they didn't really bring in a lot of accompanying talent to kind of replace that void either, and they're kind of left with a roster that's like in a weird spot where it's like decent, but the pitching is awful, and we continue to not add to the pitching. And I just had to give this offseason an F. You cannot lose a generational talent with absolutely nothing back and then not replace that talent in any way, shape, or form, except for in 1-year contracts with relatively average level players. I just can't see the vision with this team, and I just don't understand how they continue to waste players' careers. Another team that absolutely just refuses to spend money, it is the Oakland Athletics. I gave them a D plus just because while their signings weren't great, they didn't really do much there. They got Trevor Gott, Alex Wood, Scott Alexander, solid guys, but nothing spectacular by any means. They did bring in a couple of interesting names through trades. They got Abraham Toro from the Milwaukee Brewers back in early November, and also got Ross Stripling from the Giants pretty randomly. And I think both of those could be excellent trade pieces at some point. So for that, I gave them a D plus. Nothing spectacular still, but I was happy they actually went out and got anybody. I think that was a good stepping stone for the Oakland Athletics. Another team that refuses to spend money, but they do it somehow in a smarter way than the Oakland Athletics, is the Tampa Bay Rays. Oh my God, on paper, this is one of the worst off seasons I've ever seen. But I know it's the Tampa Bay Rays, so I'm going to cut them some slack. But they got rid of Luke Raley, Tyler Glasnow, Manuel Margot, and as well as Vudon Brujan already in his career. I just don't understand that. And then they only brought in Jose Cabero, Richie Palacios, Ahmed Rosario as their solution to the Wander Franco situation. it's just a rough spot to be in and rough spot to kind of observe. But I know they're going to somehow prove me wrong. Ahmed Rosario has like a 1300 plus OPS this spring. Richie Palacios is smacking the crap out of the baseball. Like, I know these players are somehow going to be just like world beaters next year. But if this was any other offseason, I'd probably give it close to an F. But for right now, I'll give them a D minus just because I know it's the Rays and I know they're just gonna just turn these guys into superstars somehow. All right, that's enough of that no spending money bull crap. We got to talk about the Los Angeles Dodgers. Oh my god, this team, it just makes me happy because they actually spend money. They actually want to make their team better. You know, and the big signing clearly was James Paxton. Yeah, that was the guy. No, but James Paxton's a good starter. Let's not give him too much crap. Teoscar Hernandez, I think, was one of the more underrated signings of their offseason. Teoscar Hernandez has some of the best batted ball data out there. Period. Case point. He just strikes out a lot, doesn't walk. But if the Dodgers can implement any of their hitting strategies like they do with anybody else, Teoscar Hernandez is going to be a superstar this year. Let's not talk about the fact that they brought in Yoshinobu Yamamoto from the Japanese League as well on a 12-year deal. Also just handed out Shohei Ohtani, the biggest contract in professional baseball. Just absolutely phenomenal. Brought back Clayton Kershaw as well. Got Daniel Hudson, Joe Kelly. Brought back Jason Hayward just for shits and gigs. You know, they had an incredible offseason. They did lose some. You know, they lost JD Martinez, who played pretty well last year. David Peralta, Colton Wong, Julio Urias, who had another situation as well as, you know, the famous Ahmed Rosario. But it didn't stop there. They brought in Tyler Glasnow via trade. Like, this team looked at the issues that they had, especially at the starting pitching staff, and said, well, that's kind of weak. We'll just make a super team out of, and then just continue to add to that spot. Like, I just love teams that just go for it. And yeah, it's obvious whenever you're playing with house money that it's a little bit easier, but oh my goodness, I love this offseason from the Los Angeles Dodgers, and I gave them the one and only A+ of the video. Another team that I think did really well this offseason, maybe not as well, but pretty well, the Arizona Diamondbacks had a very good offseason in my opinion. They brought in a couple of free agents, Jock Peterson headlining the DH spot, going to have Randall Grichuk there as well, but brought in a big-name starting pitcher, Eduardo Rodriguez. I'm not a big believer in Eduardo Rodriguez. I think a lot of what happened last year was due to the friendly confines of Detroit, but I think he is still a good serviceable, you know, depth piece for them. Maybe not worth the contract, but good starting pitcher nonetheless. They did bring back Lourdes Gurriel, and they didn't really lose a whole lot. They lost Evan Longoria, who's like kind of bad at this point in his career. Tommy Pham, who's like a good piece, but you know, not going to make or break your team. And they also brought in Eugenio Suarez through trade with the Mariners. I think Eugenio Suarez is due for a big year this season, especially in a contract year. I just think they did a lot of right things this offseason and didn't really lose a lot off of a team that made it to the World Series last year. Obviously, they didn't win a whole lot of games, so it's, you know, they have to do a lot to replicate that result. But I think the Diamondbacks pushed all the right buttons this offseason. And for that, I gave them an A-. 14th on the list is the Toronto Blue Jays, and they had a pretty interesting offseason. They brought in a couple big pieces, but also lost a couple big pieces as well. They lost Matt Chapman, Jordan Hicks, Brandon Bell, Adam Simber, even a guy like Kevin Kiermaier, who eventually came back on a deal. Brought in Isaiah Kiner-Falefa, Justin Turner. The big piece of their offseason was Yoriel Rodriguez, an exciting pitcher prospect. And then they also brought in a couple interesting guys on minor league deals. Daniel Vogelbach, Eduardo Escobar, even brought in Joey Votto, who still bangs, by the way. And then they lost a couple of other guys, you know, Whit Merrifield. But just for the most part, I think they made some good moves, made some, you know, questionable moves, losing people in free agency. Overall, I gave them a C-. Not a great offseason, but I think they did okay. Next, it feels like the St. Louis Cardinals tried to do what the Dodgers did, but just on a budget version. They just overhauled their starting pitching staff, which is what they needed to do, but I felt like they needed to go a little bit more in on it. You know, they brought in Lance Lynn, Kyle Gibson, and Sonny Gray. You know, all older pieces, and only Sonny Gray is like still a top pitcher. The other two are kind of just older inning eaters at this point, as I detailed in the Cardinals Like Horses video, as some of you may have watched. But they also brought in Keenan Middleton, who's a solid reliever, as well as aging Brandon Crawford. in case Mason Wynn doesn't, be up to snuff. But it's just an okay haul. I thought they understood their issues that they had, but they didn't necessarily fill them with the best pieces, if that makes sense. I think there were just better pieces out there to get, but overall, I think they addressed their issue and tried to at least fill the gaps. So for that, I gave them a B minus. A team that didn't feel like understood their needs as well, but just made good signings in general was the Cincinnati Reds. And the reason I don't believe they understood their issues quite as well was they brought in Jamer Candelario, who's a good player. Don't get me wrong, but this team had plenty of infield depth across the board. It was just incredible how much depth this team has. I think they lucked out a little bit by the suspension of Noelvi Marte, to be honest, because if that doesn't happen, they have a cluster of infield talent, and some of their top prospects might be missing out on playing time just because they brought in Jamer Candelario. Again, Jamer Candelario is a good player, but I just thought it kind of made more of a mess of a situation that was already kind of a mess, especially whenever you consider that they had Noelvi Marte up, they had Cruz to play shortstop, you already had Jonathan India at second base, so it kind of left some players just like grasping for playing time. Then you brought in another third base, first base type. It just really created a cluster. So it was just tough for me to understand that move. But they brought in Frankie Montas, they brought in Brent Suter, they brought in Emilio Pagan, Nick Martinez. So it looks like they understood the pitching was one of the weaker parts of the team. But I don't know. They brought in good players, but they weren't necessarily the best players. Again, kind of similar to the Cardinals. And for that, again, I'm just going to give them a B minus. 17th on the list is the Detroit Tigers, who had a pretty decent offseason, all things considered, but I don't think it's enough for them to make the next step. You look at some of the guys they brought in. They brought in Gio Urshela, Shelby Miller, Jack Flaherty, Andrew Chafin, Kenta Maeda. These are all a bunch of guys that, they're established MLB guys, but there are also might be on their way out of the MLB if they don't have a turnaround season. And I like the, low risk, high reward type players, but I don't think that these players even have the highest ceilings that they possibly could have got. Maybe like a Joey Gallo or something like that as an example. But they brought in a couple good pieces that could be great for them. They did lose Spencer Turnbull, Austin Meadows, Matthew Boyd. Not huge names to lose, but they also lost Miggy, which at this point in his career wasn't the biggest loss either, and Eduardo Rodriguez, who was their best pitcher last season. Brought in Mark Canha as well. Just kind of a lot of exchanging parts of just mid players, in my opinion. But I'm happy they went out and signed some players. So for that, I'll give them a C minus as well. Heading to Miami, they had a relatively quiet offseason, only signing one major league contract, and that was with Tim Anderson, a relatively low risk, high reward type signing. But they really didn't do a whole lot. They lost a couple names in free agency, lost Yuri Gurriel, David Robertson, Joey Wendell. None of them moved the needle too much. They did get Vidal Brujan from the Tampa Bay Rays, which I thought was a good trade piece, for them, because again, it's one of these low risk, high rewards type guys. And I like that, but I think the Miami Marlins were in a position to maybe push a little bit further to try to actually make some noise in the postseason. And they really just didn't do that, at least in my eyes, from this, free agency class. And I just think they could have done more. And for that, I give them a D. Next up is my personal favorite team, the Pittsburgh Pirates. And I think whenever you look at their offseason, I think they spent their money at the correct positions, but in the wrong way. For example, they went out and got Aroldis Chapman, who is a still pretty good reliever by all means, and they did need a left-handed reliever. But I think starting pitching was a bigger need for them. And while they did get some starting pitching, I would have preferred them to go for a little bit more known commodities. But they did fill the needs on the team. They got a few starting pitchers, got a first baseman, went and got a left-handed reliever, even went and signed Michael Taylor here as of late to really help round out this roster with MLB talent, which is something I can't say for previous Pirates off seasons. So I'm going to go ahead and give them a B, even though they didn't necessarily have the big name signing. While the Houston Astros did stay relatively quiet, not making a whole bunch of moves, I think they made big enough moves that they warranted a really good offseason, with the big headliner being Josh Hader, who agreed to a 5-year deal, as well as extending Jose Altuve. Now, it is scary kind of extending Jose Altuve just because he is already 34 years old, but it's a good signing. He hasn't really showed that much signs of regression, so We'll see how it plays out over time, but I think it's great to bring him back in, for an extended period of time. They brought in Victor Carantini on a 2-year deal. I thought it was good to just get Martin Maldonado out of the building just because I don't have that high of hopes for him, especially on a, team that should be contending for the World Series. So I think they made pretty good moves across the board and they all kind of make sense. And for that, I gave them a B plus. A team with a less inspiring offseason had to be the Cleveland Guardians. It just really didn't inspire a lot of hope. The only names they brought back in on a major league contract were Ben Lively and Austin Hedges. If you've been around this channel at all, you know how much I hate Austin Hedges. And that's really all they brought in. They brought in a few minor league deals. They brought back Carlos Carrasco. But the reason they don't get a D minus or an F is because they really didn't lose a whole lot. They lost Lucas Giolito, who was on a rental deal, Reynaldo Lopez, and Cole Calhoun. But they really didn't lose a whole lot. And I just don't think it was like enough to warrant them being like an F tier. But they didn't really do anything, so I left them at a D. Next on the list was my second favorite personal offseason, and that was the New York Yankees. I think the Yankees addressed the issues that they needed to and went ahead and just casually got a superstar in Juan Soto. Probably the biggest move, one of the biggest moves at least of the offseason. Also went and got Alex Verdugo from their divisional rivals, the Red Sox. So you're helping out your team while making the opponents worse. I think that's an excellent move. They also went ahead and grabbed Marcus Stroman. If there's any pitchers that sort of should be able to pitch in Yankee Stadium, Marcus Stroman should be one of them. He's really good at getting ground balls. And they just made really good moves pretty much across the board. They did lose a lot of names, but, none of them really moved the needle too much. They did lose a good bit in trades. But again, Michael King might be the biggest name there. A lot of them weren't necessarily big superstar names on this team. For that, I gave them an A. A team that lost out on superstars was the Milwaukee Brewers, and we have to talk about their trade of Corbin Burnes to the Baltimore Orioles. They did get a decent amount back. To be fair, they got DL Hall, Joey Ortiz, but I just don't understand why you would move off of him, especially whenever you're still looking to compete. They also lost Jesse Winker, Darren Ruff, Josh Donaldson, and Carlos Santana, as well as Rowdy Tellez. So they lost a decent amount of talent out the door. They brought in a couple big names that you would recognize, Gary Sanchez, Rhys Hoskins, but both of them are coming off of either major injuries or just kind of inconsistent players as it is. So it's really kind of tough to understand if they will, fill the void that this offense was lacking last season. So I think whenever I think about it, you're losing out on a superstar and then you are bringing in kind of question mark pieces. I wasn't the biggest fan of their offseason. I know they, made some decent moves and the grand scheme of things, but just because they lost Corbin Burnes, I think he meant so much to that team. And they lost their manager, who I think was pretty solid, and he went to a divisional rival. I think there's a chance this season falls apart for the Milwaukee Brewers, and I'm going to go ahead and give them a D minus. Another team that did lose a lot, unfortunately, this offseason was the Minnesota Twins. To be fair, the Minnesota Twins do have a young core, so they really didn't need to bring in a lot. They brought in Carlos Santana on a 1-year deal as well as Josh Staumont, but they lost a lot, especially whenever it comes to like decent role players. They lost Donovan Solano, Michael Taylor, Joey Gallo, Emilio Pagan, Jordan Luplow, but they even lost a few big name starters, like maybe not Dallas Keuchel at this point in his career, but they lost Sonny Gray, Kenta Maeda. These people played important roles for this team. They also traded away Jorge Polanco. So they lost a lot, I do admit that, but I think this team will be fine next season. But because I'm grading their offseason, they get a D from me. Prior to the Dylan Cease trade, this was my least favorite offseason of the whole entire video, and that was the San Diego Padres. They were able to rectify it with that trade, a little bit at least. The reason I didn't like their offseason was they lost so much talent, especially whenever it comes to they lost superstars, they lost role players, they lost a lot of talent off this team. They lost Josh Hader, Blake Snell, even a guy like G-Man Choi, Gary Sanchez, Luis Garcia, even, journeyman Rich Hill, Garrett Cooper. These are important players to a team that really kind of fill out a roster. And it doesn't even stop there. You have Michael Wacha, Nick Martinez, Seth Lugo. They're all off this team now, and it's really tough to like see that much talent walk out the door and think it could be a positive offseason. but I don't think it was the worst because they did rectify it a little bit with some of the talent they brought back in. They brought back in Dylan Cease, as previously mentioned, but also went ahead and grabbed Wandy Peralta, Will Saku, also brought in Yuki Matsui. So they brought in some talent. Obviously, a lot of it's foreign talent, so it's hard to know if they will actually be sustainable. It's hard to know whether it will be if they'll stick, if they'll get on their feet running. It's just that's a tough transition. You never know how that goes. But I appreciate that they went and got some people even in their kind of hard stuck financial situation. So I'm happy they tried to rectify it, unlike the Angels, which is why they aren't quite last. But I still will give them a D minus. A team that seemed to think they needed a overhaul was the Seattle Mariners, and I think they did a relatively okay job. I just don't necessarily love the players that they got rid of. They got rid of Teoscar Hernandez, and they got rid of Yannijo Suarez, which two players that I really thought were going to have a breakout season next year or bounce back, depending on how you look at it. I think they're going to be really fantastic next year, just especially because their batted ball data is just fantastic, but they didn't see it that way. And they went ahead and got a couple of veterans that should be more consistent. You look at Jorge Polanco, brought back Mitch Haniger, Luke Rayleigh from the Rays. They also went ahead and brought back in Mitch Garver, who's fantastic, as well as went ahead and grabbed Ryan Stanek. Just a good group of players they brought in. There's nothing to complain about on my end in that regard. I just don't necessarily love some of the players they relinquished to get these players. As previously mentioned, I was a big fan of some of the players they let go. So for that, I'm going to go ahead and give them a C+. Another team it was really hard not to give a completely terrible grade to was the Colorado Rockies, just because they did nothing. Like always, they did nothing. But their team isn't in a spot to really do anything that's like worth note, or else they're just kind of throwing money into the wind. The only big league contracts they signed were Jacob Stallings and Dakota Hudson, neither of which are going to move the needle too much. The reason they can't put them much lower than a D, though, is because they didn't lose all that much either. They only lost guys like Chase Anderson, Brent Suter, as well as Chris Flexen. Just none of them really moved the needle that much either, so they didn't lose a whole lot. So I think that's why I have the D minus and F spot is for teams that I think got significantly worse. So I'm going to go ahead and put the Rockies at D. Another uninspiring offseason had to come from the Chicago White Sox. We knew this team was probably going to be tearing down the remainder of this roster, but they did so mostly in a way they got nothing back. They just basically gave away Tim Anderson, Liam Hendricks, and Mike Clevenger, none of which they got a return from at all. They also let people like Elvis Andrus, Clint Frazier, Jose Urania all leave in free agency, so it just wasn't a great offseason just from that perspective. And then they didn't really bring anybody back in. They only signed 4 or 5, big league contracts, and none of them are going to move the needle all too much. They got some interesting names in trades. They got Michael Soroka and Max Stassi from the Braves, but they just were a lot of lackluster names as well as giving away Dylan Cease. It's just not a great offseason in total, but there's some hope, I guess. They got Luis Robert, I guess. Yay. I don't know. There's not much to say about this White Sox offseason. They did pretty bad. They didn't really bring in a whole lot. Had to be a D minus from me. While the list of trades and free agent signings for the Baltimore Orioles was rather short, they nailed their pieces to a T. They went ahead and grabbed the Corbin Burns trade from the Milwaukee Brewers. I thought it was a fantastic deal. Obviously, they have a surplus of minor league talent, and they didn't really need these guys. And they brought in a true ace for this pitching staff to go along with Grayson Rodriguez and Kyle Bradish. I think they should form out this rotation, which I think really was the lackluster piece of this roster last year. They didn't really lose much in terms of players. They lost a lot of role players off this team. Didn't really lose a true superstar by any means. And they also brought in their replacement to Felix Bautista, who unfortunately missed this season due to Tommy John. And they brought in Craig Kimbrell, who did look a bit shaky with the Phillies. But, he's an experienced vet that's been at the top of the game for some time now. So I have no complaints from them. I would have liked them, if they wanted to compete with the Dodgers or something, they would have had to go absurd and get way more pieces. But for the most part, I think they did what was necessary to continue to improve their roster. And I gave them an A minus. The final team of the video is the Atlanta Braves, who did have a lot of moving parts this offseason. Over the offseason, they had lost Kirby Yates, Colin McHugh, Eddie Rosario, Brad Hand, as well as Michael Soroka and a few other, kind of mediocre names. No superstars really got exchanged, but they did bring in some interesting names, with Chris Sale, I think, being the big name that I really kind of latch onto, because I think Chris Sale is still fantastic if he can just stay healthy. Last season, we saw him put together 20 starts for the first time and in some time, to be honest. So I think it was a pretty good trade to go ahead and get him. They also brought in Ronaldo Lopez, Adam Duvall is back, as well as Luis Guillorme. Just, I think, a pretty good offseason, but nothing that is crazy. It all is kind of dependent on if Chris Sale can stay healthy. I'm going to go with history. He can't really stay healthy from what we've seen. So I'm going to go ahead and give them a C, but I think there is room for that to improve. Thank you so much for watching. I know it was a long one, but I appreciate you guys for sticking it out. Thank you guys again for watching. Please subscribe. And as always, have a wonderful, wonderful day.